I think we'll get rolling here. Welcome to the final event of our 5th annual Animal Law Week. My name is Chris Green. I'm the Executive Director of the Animal Law and Policy Program here at Harvard Law School. And I'd like to first thank our co-hosts of this event, which is the Harvard Animal Law Society. We've got the two co-presidents here with us, Kate Barnacow and Gabriel Wilgen. So for this event, just because we're not busy enough, during this week, in addition to Animal Law Week, we decided to host a kind of a closed-door roundtable that had several different experts from different realms trying to assess the viability of setting up a new type of organization that would be sort of an accelerator model to try and accelerate or incentivize, encourage technological advances that provide alternatives to animal experimentation and research. So we had a really great group. It was spearheaded by Nathan Hershler, who is the Executive Director of the New England Anti-Vivisection Society. So he's going to lead off talking about sort of what we discussed and what the genesis of the idea was. And we've also got Catherine Willett, who is the Senior Director for Science and Regulatory Affairs at the Humane Society of the United States. So with that, I will leave it to Nathan. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to stand up. It's really nice seeing a lot of the same faces that have been here all week. How many of you guys have actually been here at every single one of these this week? Is there anybody? Yeah? Nice. Well, that doesn't count, Kate. And how many have been to like 3 or 4? All right, almost everybody. Really cool. Yeah, and huge thanks to Chris for hosting us this week as well. Amazing to have the convening power of Harvard Law School to try to bring together diverse stakeholders. One of the challenges that you have when you run an animal rights organization is sometimes it's hard to get people from the other side to try to come and talk to you. And so being able to collaborate with such an amazing institution and group of people is really a credit to the name and the people that you have here. As Chris mentioned, we had a really productive week this week. I'm tired. I put together this presentation last night and this morning, so excuse any minor spelling or graphical errors that are on there. I'm actually going to start by talking a little bit about Neves, the organization that I run as a whole, and then I'll move into sort of the work that we've done this week. And the reason I'm doing that is because I've started at Neves about a year and a half ago at this point, and we've made some huge changes to the organization. And I think what we've done is laid out a vision for the future that is going to be really productive and help us transform the way that we work in the animal research anti-vivisection space. I have some nice ex-employees here. We've lost Elizabeth, who was on our team, to MSPCA recently, so I may refer to her at some point in this for expertise that I don't have. And thank you to Kate, too, who I'm a lawyer by training, so I have none of the scientific background on any of this stuff, so I'm really thankful that we have some really good science minds here, if there are any questions related to that type of stuff. Okay, so as I mentioned, I'm going to quickly run through our strategic plan and the new work that we're doing in exposing a lot of the animal research that's occurring around the country. I'm going to talk about our work that we're doing that we're sort of classifying under an opposition to animal research. And then I'm going to talk about the work that we were doing this week around alternatives. And then there's some information about how you can reach out to me afterwards if you have any questions. Okay, so when I was in 3rd grade, I had just moved to the Boston area from Chicago, and I was with my dad at Franklin Park Zoo, and it was my first trip to Franklin Park Zoo, and I actually haven't been to a zoo in a long time, but what I remember about that zoo is that it sort of had big open spaces, and I was always a wildlife junkie. I was the kid who would turn on Wild America to watch Marty Stouffer, and I would sort of peruse PBS to try to find the lion documentaries that they were pushing on there. So I was super excited to get to the zoo. And we were walking through the zoo, and we got to the primate house, I was really excited to see these animals. It's one of the charismatic, large species that are out there. I'd seen lots of things on there. And so I walked in, and on the left there were a couple small monkey exhibits. But on the other side of the building, there was this sort of crowd that had gathered around one of the windows, and I was curious. And so I walked up there. And then I noticed the parents sort of grabbing their kids and quickly moving them away from the window. And I looked, and I saw that a gorilla was chewing on something, and sort of taking it out of its mouth and smearing it on the window, and then sort of picking it back up again and sort of putting it back in its mouth and chewing on it again. It was only after a minute or two of sort of looking at the faces of the parents and the children who were sort of pointing and laughing, and then back at the gorilla, to sort of realize that what the animal was doing was taking its own feces and eating it and swiping it and repeatedly doing this. And it was the sort of first time in my life that I had realized that the animals that were sort of kept in these types of circumstances weren't quite right. And I wasn't really like old enough to process the sort of like how wrong that was and how broken the animal was who was having to do that. But it really started to inform my thinking sort of beyond just the emotional attachment that I was feeling to animals. And so I had a really ambitious grandfather who, when I was in high school, thought that I was sort of slacking off, and I was, so he was right. So he sent me to a career coach, and I was like 16 or 17 at the time. I thought that was a little ambitious of him, and but it was actually ended up being this really meaningful and powerful experience in my youth. When I was talking to the woman who was my career coach, she realized and recognized that the thing that made me light up when I was talking about the things that I could possibly do in my future was when I was talking about animals, and the animals, I had been volunteering for the local Humane Society shelter and all that kind of stuff. And that was sort of like where my energy and excitement was. And I had never really considered that there was anything I could do to help animals as a career at that point. But she actually had some contacts at Stone Zoo in Stoneham, just north of the city. And so she got me an internship there about 6 months later. I was about 18. I had just started going. It was my first year of college. And so I went up there and I had my first zoo, like working at a zoo experience. It was my only working at a zoo experience. And I quickly realized two things. One is that I am not cut out for mucking stalls. It is not something that I want to do with my life. But the second thing that I saw is that the same type of repetitive stereotypic behavior that I had witnessed when I was in like 3rd grade with this poor gorilla who had clearly broken was repeated in just about every single species that was being kept at the zoo. Some more than others, but for example, they had these wolves that were literally just had worn down a path, running back and forth across their small enclosure over however many years they had been there. And so that was sort of like my next realization point where I started to move beyond just this concept of just liking animals to realizing that there was something really that we needed to do to try to address animal suffering. So anyway, I went to law school. I did animal protection stuff in law school. And then I worked for 10 years for the International Fund for Animal Welfare, which is a big international animal protection conservation organization, out of law school. And about 1.5 years ago, I joined Neves. And so Neves has been around since 1895. And that used to be one of the big selling points of the organization, is that it sort of had this great and grand history. And I really struggle with that, right? Because in my mind, one of the things that we have to do as an organization is try to put ourselves out of business. And so when I got to Neves, I was like, well, this 120 years is great. It means that we have a really nice, sustainable organization from a business model perspective, but it means that we've also been failing year after year for almost 125 years. And so we took on a really ambitious strategic planning process, and we identified a number of areas where Neves could, and after consulting with a lot of people in the field, where Neves can really try to add value to the field. And so we built a new strategic plan that were sort of focused on these three key areas: exposure, opposing animal research, and then supporting the development of alternatives. We also continue to do some sanctuary support work. So the first thing that we decided to do was exposure, and I pushed my board to try to look at some of the issues around undercover investigation work, but of course there's a lot of legal issues associated with that. And so we really sort of took a step back and realized that we could get a lot of the same information through the Freedom of Information Act. We hired a couple different attorneys who are pretty well known in the movement for doing transparency issues. And at this point now, about 3 months into this big project, we've now submitted well more than 200 FOIA requests to NIH and USDA to try to get information about a couple things. One, whether there are any types of violations of animal welfare protections that are covered under the Animal Welfare Act and USDA, but also a lot of the sort of other types of violations that might occur in the course of animal care and behaviors at universities or other research facilities that receive NIH or other government funding. And we're starting to get results back already from this. We're also starting to get a lot of pushback from NIH and USDA about just the vast number of FOIA requests that we're submitting. But we're working with them right now, and we're going to be trying to focus on what are called Category D and Category E experiments. Kate can probably speak to this more eloquently than I can, but the way that I like to think of it is that Category E experiments are the sort of ones that are about are painful experiments that for animals that are not mitigated in any way with any sort of pain remedies. And so these are the types of things that you do for brain trauma type of exercises that the military will do, or other types of lethal experiments that are done on animals. And they're done on millions of animals in the United States every year. Category D experiments are also similarly invasive experiments, but they do mitigate some of the pain experiences of those animals. So we're really focusing on those, and we're focusing on those from the perspective of primates, dogs, and cats, which are the ones that are 3 of the species that are covered under the Animal Welfare Act. And I'm sure that some of you guys know that there are a number of species that are not covered by the Animal Welfare Act: mice, rats, birds, and fish. So it's much harder to get information about those. Excuse me, my pizza's coming back up. And so assuming that we have a really good opportunity to work with NIH and USDA to sort of collaborate in getting a lot of this information, which is the obligation of them, then we won't have to rely too much on litigation. But based on the experience of a lot of the other animal protection groups, we do suspect that we're going to have a fair amount of litigation occurring over the course of the next couple years to get all the information that we think, including photos and videos and other instances of animal abuse, which are required to be taken when USDA and Neves find evidence of violations of the Animal Welfare Act. Okay. We also revamped our opposition strategies, and we're really focusing on 2 things. We found a big gap that a lot of the organizations had moved actually out of traditional government affairs work, and there's a lot of policy stuff that's happening in the field. But there's very few organizations that actually have staff that have history working in Congress with congressional members. And so we went out and tried to purposely find staff who both had a passion for animal rights and animal protection, but also had worked with Congress people. So they really knew the ins and outs of things like the appropriations process. And for any of you who have worked on policy issues before, it's often not the big bills that you hear about, like the Humane Cosmetics Act or some of these things where we try to ban things that actually move forward pretty aggressively, but you can get some really substantial victories by working sort of under the scenes through things like the appropriations process. And so Mike Ryan, who's on our team, worked for years with Nancy Pelosi and the DCCC, and now has, and then worked for PETA after that, and so now he's with us, and he's focusing on some of that work. And then we also, outside of PETA, there's not a lot of organizations that are really focused on our issue, on really ground-up grassroots organizing types of activities. And so we also went out and found somebody who has a tremendous amount of experience doing this, and we hired recently woman named Amy Meyer, who some of you may have heard of again. She was the lead plaintiff in the Utah ag-gag case. And so she helped overturn that law in the last few years, working with Matthew Strugar, who's one of our attorneys. So she's now helping build out our whole grassroots effort, and we've already started a couple of those campaigns. And so we hope to really expand this type of work over the course of the next couple of years and try to be one of those organizations that are actually getting things done on the ground. Okay, just a couple really quick examples. This is one of the grassroots campaigns that we're kicking off right now is going to be at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, where there's a researcher who has been basically making her career out of adding and removing estrogen and testosterone from marmosets and other primates. The research that's being done there, as you can see, this picture is from a similar research paper that was published a few years ago. They are in the most recent version of this research, they're actually removing the ovaries of some marmosets to sort of induce menopausal type of symptoms, so they can start to test whether this species is actually going to be an accurate replica of what we can do to test drugs for menopause treatment. It's not just that invasive surgery that they undergo, but they also install these telemeters into their heads and directly onto their brains to monitor the impact of that research on things like body temperature and heart rate and all that kind of stuff. It's sort of like wearing my Apple Watch, but into your brain. And they've had some pretty horrific instances of abuse that have occurred in violations of the Animal Welfare Act. One of the things that we exposed in one of our first FOIA requests from UMass was that one of the marmoset monkeys that were subject to not the current round of research, but the previous round of research, had gone through a successful surgery to remove or to do something to the animal. So it was a marmoset again. And in the post-treatment thing, they put a heating blanket onto the animal with a heating blanket and then left. The heating blanket malfunctioned, and the animal was burned to death post-surgery. So we know that there are these types of problems that are occurring time after time across all of these research facilities. We've really focused on trying to get a lot of this information out, and we're going to be trying to work now with the student groups at some of the universities like this. We're working there at more pizza, excuse me, at University of Virginia and in Utah to try to develop some first-time grassroots campaigns, leveraging the student body to try to get change at the policy level at those universities where they're accepting research funding for this type of work. We also exposed a violation of the Animal Welfare Act that happened at Purina's animal care center from a couple years ago. And in the case that we found, they have a ton of animals at these places. It's mostly dogs and cats, and they're doing sort of testing of new formulations of their dog and cat food with these animals for, I imagine, toxicity testing. But in one case from a couple years ago, they keep these animals in relatively large cages that are on wheels. And so the staff that was responsible for cleaning up after these cages didn't notice that there was still one cat that was left in one of these things. And they brought it to one of the commercial cleaning rooms that they had in the building. And as you can see from this quote, which is coming straight from the Animal Welfare Act violations report, the cat was found deceased in the cage after probably having been scalded to death in essentially a high-powered washing machine. So we launched a campaign recently. We did things like we sent mailers out to the entire town where the CEO of Purina lives, and to try to we sent this mailer specifically to try to create some local pressure and make the guy feel embarrassed as a result of the type of work that they're doing. And we're also doing sort of the traditional advocacy type of campaigns for those types of things as well. We also had some early victories. As I mentioned just a few minutes ago, we've been trying to work more through the appropriations process than we have in the past. And in the funding bill that was just passed at the federal level, we were able to get into that some language to end these cruel tests that are occurring at a USDA facility in Maryland that will require the USDA, rather than killing kittens that are 6 months old and that can be adopted out with a very simple treatment, antibiotic treatment for toxoplasmosis that costs somewhere between $60 and $80 per animal. In the past, they've been killing those animals at the end of the research. The language now is going to be requiring the USDA facility to try to find a way to get those animals out and not have terminal ends of those studies. So we're already getting some good victories associated with this type of work, and I can't wait to see what a lot of the other stuff is going to lead to in the future. Okay, so that's the background stuff for what Neves is doing, and so that leads me to what we have been doing this week. And so the third tier of what we're doing is around replacing animal experimentation. And historically speaking, a lot of the organizations that have worked on this issue have relied on really just making very small grants to individual researchers. And so there may be somebody that's developing a tissue on a chip, or some sort of like computational model where you're able to sort of plug in a lot of data that sort of spits out some information that that will tell you whether or not something is going to have an adverse effect on people or not. And Kate is an expert in this, so I won't try to pretend like I know what I'm talking about. And that stuff is great, right? But in the end, we've been doing this stuff for 100-something years, and the scale that we're able to really move to the development of these new technologies has just been completely insufficient to try to do anything about that. The other area where animal protection organizations have been relatively strong over the past couple decades is in policy and regulatory type of work. And groups like HSUS and PCRM and PETA have all been pretty successful actually working with the government to try to, collaborate effectively on a lot of the legal and regulatory affairs type of work around animal research and testing and developing alternatives for that. So we didn't really want to get involved in either of those two things as Neves, as we were thinking through our new strategic plan. But we also had seen sort of the success of the Good Food Institute. Have you guys all heard of the Good Food Institute? Yeah, okay. Has anybody not heard about the Good Food Institute? Okay, 1, 2, all right, cool, 3. We'll talk. Yeah, that's great. And maybe a few of you guys who didn't want to raise your hands. So I will talk to you guys about that in just a couple minutes. Actually, I'll talk about it right now. So the Good Food Institute is a new nonprofit organization that had come up in the food sector, and it was spun off of an organization called Mercy for Animals. And Mercy for Animals a couple years ago had decided in one of their meetings that they wanted to look at sort of the world of farmed animal protection to try to identify what could be done to really accelerate the development of alternatives to animal products. And so they went through a series of projects, one of which was to spin off this new organization called the Good Food Institute. And the Good Food Institute has, over the last 3 years, since it's come into existence, been one of the drivers of creation of new companies and to accelerate the development of existing companies like Beyond Meats and Impossible Foods, which are now able to be seen in local restaurants and markets. Carl's Jr. just brought the Beyond Burger, and Impossibles all over the place. And Hampton Creeks, which is now Just Foods, and a series of other companies that have been supported. So we were looking at that model and we're like, well, there is absolutely no reason we couldn't try to bring the same type of approach to the animal research world. And there's some really interesting statistics that sort of support the need for something that is disruptive in this field. 95% of experiments that are done on animals that show some sort of positive result in those animal tests, when they move to human clinical trials, they fail. So there's really not a huge benefit of doing a lot of that work. And at the same time, we've been doing things like studying things like heart disease for decades now, and we lose somebody in the United States about every 52 seconds to chronic heart disease issues. But there are still no cures. And that's true for cancers, and it's true for Alzheimer's, and it's true for diabetes. We've been doing research on these things and have been finding cures in animals for decades at this point, none of which has led to any sort of meaningful treatment in humans. And just one example of that is that in a recent paper, a couple years old now at this point, out of 22 successful traumatic brain injury research protocols that had been undertaken using animals, and you can imagine what that might have looked like for the poor animals, where they're inducing traumatic brain injury on those animals. 0 of them led to any sort of meaningful result in humans. Just a couple more statistics. The NIH funds about $12 billion of animal research by itself every year. That compares to about 300 million was our count that we did in the last appropriations bill for alternatives to animal testing. The likely total amount of money that's being spent on animal research across US government agencies by itself is probably north of $20 billion. So this is an industry that is ripe for disruption from a monetary perspective. You can see that there's some money around and being provided by us, US taxpayers, for animal research in this way. So this doesn't include any of the private funding that's being used for this work either. We also have a best estimate that there's more than 100 million animals that are being killed as a result of animal research and testing every year globally. We also think that that number is probably a vast underestimate of what the true numbers are. And when you start to take into account fish and insects and other animals that are regularly used in animal research, the number is probably much, much higher. So this past week, we hosted a workshop that Chris had mentioned that was originally called the Good Science Institute until Bruce Friedrich, who runs the Good Food Institute, told me I'm not allowed to do that anymore. And so then we changed the name to the Better Science Society until we realized that that comes out to the BS Society. And so we focused on a new name, and so you'll see that in just a second. But a huge thanks to the Quinn Foundation and to Harvard and to Spring Point for hosting that workshop with us this week and providing some of the funding. We were able to bring together, as Chris mentioned, a lot of these diverse stakeholders to really try to see whether there actually is a business model here for the nonprofit sector, a 501c3 nonprofit that can be developed like the Good Food Institute to both create and accelerate the development of new companies that can be both profitable and help save the world and human lives. The whole goal of this is to move out of philanthropy, right? We want to be able to leverage markets that exist and the billions of dollars that are available for alternatives to animal research to move beyond the sort of small-scale cash that philanthropic donors are able to bring to bear on this issue. And so we're going to be doing, as a matter of first exercises, and we'll be doing this through Neves as we try to build out the 501c3, we're going to be doing some research to identify basically where the gaps are, where are the white spaces in the world that will allow us to identify potentially profitable companies that can make a major change for animal protection in this space and also for human health and welfare. Our goal that we came up with this week is that we're going to try to fully replace animal research and testing within 30 years. It's ambitious. We heard this week that there are probably some instances where there will still continue to need to be some type of animal research that they find is beneficial to human health and welfare that probably won't be able to be replaced by new technologies in this time frame. Fair enough. But if we can really aim for this target, then I think that we're going to be able to make such a dramatic impact on those hundreds of millions of animals potentially that we are trying to save that we can effectively put ourselves out of business. How are we going to do it? And so this is actually basically very similar to the Good Food Institute structure. we're both going to build and accelerate companies. We're going to be offering, like a venture capital firm does, the science and technology mentorship and then also the legal and business mentorship that it takes to bring nascent technology ideas to become profitable companies that can then be sold for their intellectual property or for other reasons. We're going to be working with researchers and entrepreneurs and technologists to try to give them the access to the technology that already exists in the world. And a lot of this technology already does exist in the world that people don't know about. And novel ways of leveraging some of this technology, like organs on a chip technology that can be moved into this space to create new approaches to replacing animal research and testing. Perhaps most importantly, like a traditional venture capital firm, there's a huge opportunity to start working with both traditional biotech funders, but also the larger now animal impact investors that are starting to emerge out of the field to bring new money and existing money to bear and try to start to replace that NIH contribution of $12 billion and hopefully flip it. So we get to a point where the research that's happening is $12 billion for alternatives and $300 million for animal research and testing. And then importantly, because the older generation of researchers are trained in animal methods, one of the things that we would love to be able to do is develop curricula that do not require the use of animal research and testing for advancement into PhD programs and medical programs, and hopefully we can start to train folks that there are these alternative approaches that can be both profitable and impactful for animal and human health. So basically, what we're planning to do is to leverage investments to save animals and humans. And that's a really high level of what we did this week, and I'm happy to talk with Chris, who is also participating in this, in some more of the details and what the immediate plans are and what the needs are and all that kind of stuff. So hopefully you're as excited about that as I am about the potential to completely eliminate a field of animal cruelty that will end up saving hundreds of millions of animals. You can contact Neves here. And I can give you, anybody who's interested in this issue, I'm happy to talk to more about. We have this really great advisory committee that's starting to build up, and I'm going to ask Kate to be on it as well. So if anybody's interested in participating in some of the knowledge building around this, we'd be certainly happy to talk to you guys. And thank you.
Great, thanks. And so one of the reasons I kind of felt this was so important, I'm also on the side participating in a National Academy of Sciences committee currently that is assessing whether the Veterans Administration should continue funding and conducting biomedical research on dogs. And from a movement perspective, farmed animal issues were always got short shrift and not much funding. Now that's sort of reversed with the sort of rise of effective altruism, and you hear this common mantra of how many animals can I save per dollar. People are sort of looking in the aggregate, and when you have 60+ billion farmed animal, just land animals worldwide being killed each year for food, comparatively it makes the number of animals in research look tiny. So certain funders are like, well, why should we bother funding something that's involving a much smaller number of animals? The issue is that, as you see with this VA committee and the NIH committee a few years back that basically brought it into federally funded chimp testing, there's a lot. The research community gets it. They understand that the tide is turning as far as public opinion goes. And so they're very reachable right now. And I think there's a room for some really big breakthroughs here. So that's why we felt it's really important to be involved in this. So I just want to turn it over to Kate and just say, I was really shocked to find during this past week that there are actually probably 20+ companies that are working on developing organ on a chip. I think you saw a photo one a minute ago here. Can you talk a little bit about what some of the actual alternatives are scientifically and sort of with their viability and how they're being used?
I'm happy to. So I've been, just as a slight bit of introduction.
Let's see, the green light is on. There we go.
Okay, thanks. So my history, for about somewhere between 15 and 20 years, I was a research biologist, and I did work with animals. And through some events that happened in my life and things that I noticed in my own research, I began to question if whether there wasn't a better way to do this. And I came to the animal protection community about 12, 13 years ago and started working on the science and policy of focusing on alternatives. I mean, focusing on replacement. Because we are at a time right now where the technology is catching up with the aspiration. And it's also becoming apparent in both the medical community and the pharmaceutical community, and Nathan was talking about this earlier, that our traditional ways of relying heavily on animal experimentation are falling short in terms of our expectations for human health ameliorations. And there are now these great opportunities for these better ways. So one of the better, there's many different approaches that one takes, and organs on a chip is definitely a really interesting technological development. So right here in Boston, there's some leading forefront technology happening at the Wyss Institute, which is Harvard and MIT. There's some stunning biologists, but engineers and bioinformaticists that are all working together to create these things that are basically mimicking the functioning of human organs. So they can do any species, but human organs miniaturized on a small thing that's about the size of a microscope slide, and they have now many different tissues. They have the structural functionality and some of the actual physical functionalities, and then the biological functionalities of the actual tissues. And they're beginning to be able to link these things together so you can have circuits and have a sort of a mimic of the circulation. And that's a very, very promising new technology. And right here in Boston is a good place to start something like this, because there are so many people with the expertise right here. But there's also different kinds of technologies. There's other kinds of culture systems, and there's also actually just our better use of all the information that we have. I mean, we've been generating biological information for decades now from all different species, and the thing is we don't use it very well. Because what do we do as scientists? We publish it in journals. So we publish it in these articles that are in PDFs that are, they're sitting in these different places. But what now NIH is starting to do and other people are starting to do is try to get all that data out of those journal articles and siloed in reports and government agencies and stuff, and put them together in databases that relate the information to each other. So now we're sort of starting to see a little bit what is real systems biology. So, we've been taking biology apart for over 100 years. And now we're at the point where we can use computers to assist us in putting it back together. And in that way, you can actually query things in a computer in ways that humans can't, because humans can design experiments that have one or two variables. This is the way we think. But the biology is not. Biology is really complicated. Not only are there hundreds of things interacting all at once, but they're moving in time. Mm-hmm. And so to design an experiment that really tests something real, a computer is very helpful. And we're getting there. And so the combination of these things is bringing us now to the point where we can think about replacing animals. And we have been replacing them, but as Nathan said, very slowly, piecemeal way. And there's a transition happening, and it's happening in our federal government, in the pharmaceutical industry, as well as, the regulators are a bit lagging behind. But this is a really good time for an incubator like this. And there are some gaps that really need to be filled. So I'm very excited about the potential for this.
And one problem too with what you said, that even all those PDFs you talk about, those are only documenting experiments that worked.
Right.
So you can have sort of like my analogy is sort of like a bridge being out and not having a sign, where someone going to conduct an experiment that doesn't work, but none of those results get published. So all these people after them keep kind of driving in and driving off the bridge, which is a waste of their time, it's a waste of money, and it's a waste of animal lives. So finding some way to sort of publish, get some sort of clearinghouse for that would be great as well.
Exactly. Yeah, that's it.
And just to add to that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but this is something that they've already done in the context of human clinical trials, is it not? They essentially require the registration of both your methodology and the raw data at some point.
And it has to be publicly available, which is not true in the rest of research, and certainly not true in the pharmaceutical industry.
And with the Good Food Institute model, I mean, I think when they started in 2016, right around the same time, the first cell-based meat company got started, Memphis Meats. And I think now, there's close to 37, just here we are 3 years later, not even 2.5 years later, and there's 37 different cell-based meat companies or meat and other products working in the cellular ag space. I mean, it just really shows you the value that Good Food Institute has had. And I think in addition to being an incubator, I think that this organization could, as the Good Food Institute has, serve as sort of a de facto industry trade group first to sort of help educate the public about this and help sort of interact with some of the regulators and other government agencies that have a stake in this.
Mm-hmm. And there's a slightly added complexity to this because unlike food, where you're creating a product and you're sort of mimicking the product, it's kind of information, and so one thing is not going to replace an animal. It's not going to replace the information that you would get. So you have to really think about how you're going to integrate information from multiple different sources and put it together in a package. So you have a company that has a particular tissue type, but that's not in itself going to replace animals. You have to figure out how these are all going to work together to create the information, and especially in a research situation, where you're asking sort of open-ended questions. I mean, that's a larger problem, but even in the regulatory space where you have this long list of things that you want answered, how you answer those questions is going to involve the integration of multiple different types of information. And something like this could really be helpful in trying to figure out what that is and how they can be packaged and how these companies will have to work together, because people will want to order, they'll need the products and the information from multiple sources.
And again, as Nathan was saying, with this model, yes, it will require a little bit of philanthropic help to get off the ground, but the whole goal is to just incentivize actual investment. So there's the companies are getting it because there's a chance to sort of make a return on their investment. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, okay, we'll give everyone just a couple minutes. If anyone needs to leave for class, we'll let you leave now, and then we'll start the Q&A in a couple minutes. Or get more pizza.
Some of it's already happening, I mean, the pharmaceutical industry is developing a lot of this stuff because they see the promise in terms of reduced cost to market, but also just the overall efficiency.
I think that's right. And I think that there's going to be potential. One of the things we were talking about this week is the potential for partnership opportunities with pharmaceutical industry and chemical industry in particular as the ones where there's the highest potential profit margin, moving outside of sort of like the regulatory tox world where the profit margin is probably significantly lower.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, except in some of the safety. I mean, because safety is for pharma has been a big problem, but it's also been they are not sure how to approach it really. So yeah, I mean, okay. It costs over $1 billion to bring a drug
All right,
to market.
So we're going to move to the Q&A portion. I'm going to have a microphone. If you can please put up your hand if you have a question, and wait till I get to you because we'd like that question to be recorded as well. Am I on? Okay, any questions? There we go.
Yeah, so hi, thank you so much. This is super exciting. I'm wondering on the 95% figure that you showed, is that different from like what you would expect background? Like, is there a statistically significant difference between that and non-animal screened trials?
So, well, I'm not exactly sure which the number he was referring to, but the number that I have in my mind is more than 90, somewhere around 95% of drugs fail in clinical trials, and so that's not saying exactly that it's all due to the animal failure. But what it does tell you is, well, they fail for a couple of reasons. One is because of unforeseen toxicity that pops up in the humans. That's rarer. But more often what happens is a lack of efficacy in the humans. Mm-hmm. And so what that's saying is really that the biology that's represented in the animal is different enough from the human that most of the time, and this is true, most of the time it's not the same. And there's a couple of things that go into that, because biology itself is inherently variable. So if you go back and look at the animal experiments, and where there are databases where the same chemical, for example, or the same drug has been tested multiple times in the same test, you see wide variability. I mean, it can be orders of magnitude different. And within the same species, within just repeated experiments. So there's that variability, but also there's a very significant difference between the animals. So people say, oh yeah, well, monkeys and humans, they're 98% the same. It's those 2%, that 2% difference that really, it has a big impact, particularly in the response to chemicals, because the response to chemicals or exogenous things that you run into is heavily dependent on how your body processes those things. So how it's absorbed, how it's distributed, how it's metabolized, and how it's excreted. And those small differences between species have dramatic impacts on those things. So a drug can fail for all kinds of reasons, but all of those added up all together results in this 90-some-odd% failure rate.
Nice. And isn't it true that we're something like 92% genetically identical with bananas as well?
Well, yeah, that's right. There's a lot of basic systematic biology that happens that makes you alive.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I also had a comment about the failed study statistic. I worked for 2 years in vaccine research on human clinical trials, and a lot of the researchers I worked with thought that failed studies were a positive thing because you publish them, and then hopefully researchers in the future do a comprehensive literature review and see this is a failed method, I will no longer pursue this. So I was hoping you could comment on that. And then also, in my previous research, some of the technicians would be flown out to southern states to do primate research. And I was hoping you could comment on, if these methods are banned, how you discourage people from going elsewhere.
That is a great question. Thanks.
You want to handle the first part of it, or?
Sure, and I could also impinge on the last part a little bit.
Yeah.
The first part was about so the negative. So yes, it is one of the places where you would get negative data, one of the few places. But unfortunately, it doesn't always tell you why. Sometimes it does. But yes, it is very important. But you don't want to base your whole clinical development system on 95% failure rate. Yes, and then the second part, yes, that is very important. And one of the things that we work on, and one of the things that is the global situation. So people will always go where it's cheaper, where it's less regulated, so the idea is level playing field across the world. So we're starting in a place, we have this Be Cruelty-Free campaign. So what we're starting in is just leveling the playing field across the world, where you prohibiting the sales and testing of cosmetics on animals. So start simple. But you also have to work with other countries and areas to educate them around animal welfare issues. Some countries it's not even on their radar at all. And also the global marketplace can be effective in bringing people up. So I work a lot in China right now, and the fact that China wants to engage with the international marketplace is having dramatic effect on the way they do business, on just the fact that they're engaging with international regulations and international test guidelines and all of that stuff. So the international marketplace can have a big effect.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, one of the things that we've seen in the last few years is that I think it is true that there's more pressure to publish failure data in human clinical type of work than there is in the animal study world. One of the big failures that we have, and Chris was sort of referring to this just a moment ago, is that there is not necessarily the same incentive, nor is there any sort of requirement of publishing failure data for a lot of the preclinical animal-based studies. And so we do think that there's probably a lot of replication that's occurring with research that's failed at least once before. And that's just, in my mind, that's wastage of animal lives, of taxpayer dollars, and more. And on the primates issue, I totally agreed. I think it's a really big problem. We can actually see some examples of that. Just to note a couple statistics, at the moment we have actually more primates in the United States being actively used in research than we have at any time in history. The actual numbers of animals being both used actively in research and in sort of breeding colonies is not at an all-time high, but it's about 105,000 primates in the United States at this point in both of those things, and about 70,000 of them, roughly, are being actively used in animal research at the moment. So it's still a pretty substantial problem. Some of you may know that in 2015, they put in place a de facto ban on the use of chimpanzees in animal research. Basically, NIH said that there would no longer be funding flowing to research using chimpanzees after a systematic review. As far as I know, that hasn't resulted in chimpanzee research moving elsewhere in the world. I haven't.
Well, nobody in the world allows chimpanzee research except Gabon in the United States.
Well, there you go.
But there you go. It's already, it's sort of a harmonized playing field already.
Yeah. So that's good. But we do see. So, for example, like we have more strict rules in the United States around human-animal chimeras, the sort of like hybridized genetic mice with human genetic material being implanted into them, or rats, or primates. And you'll have seen likely in the news relatively recently, a couple months ago now, some Chinese researchers successfully cloned, genetically modified, what were they, marmosets?
Yes.
Something.
But and they're also using CRISPR to do everything.
Yeah.
So they're now making genetically modified every single species you can think of, including humans.
Yeah, so CRISPR technology is basically they're knocking out individual gene sequences and replacing it with something else to try to create hybridized animals. And so one of the things that we're actually looking at in the United States context is to see at what point do you start regulating those now human-animal hybrids that are no longer the species that they originally were, additional legal protections up to the level of human clinical protections. ALDF actually has a petition for rulemaking into somebody about this right now, and there's been no response. So I suspect that there will probably be a lawsuit coming around a failure to move on that at some point in the future. And when that happens, we will probably join that litigation and push for even more stringent standards associated with that.
A question here.
Yeah, thank you both for your contributions today. And I have two questions, actually, one of which is very technical, technically oriented, and the other one of which just has more to do with that 30%, 30-year replacement of animal testing. So the first one is just, both of you had touched on this idea, as well as Chris, of this idea that the kind of true negatives aren't out there for us to find, so that we keep kind of driving off that cliff. But what about the issue, and is anyone focusing this on the issue of false positives? And the fact that a lot of animal testing, particularly coming out of drug companies, relies on very shoddy statistical design that is designed to move drugs along and trials along, even if they aren't effective. And maybe the White Coast Waste Project is focusing on this, but it's a very unappealing, unattractive issue to just look at bad statistical design. You can't really rally funders behind this, but it does seem like low-hanging fruit if anything can be done about it. And the second one of which is a lot of the systems technology that you're talking about and the computation reflects organs and kind of biophysical systems in humans, but what about cognitive and biochemical systems that are being used to test like behavioral therapies or mental drugs, which is a lot of animal testing, is understanding how a creature with a brain works. And when there are literally trillions of connections, I don't really understand that this can happen without an advent in quantum computing. So my non-technical question isn't non-technical either, but hopefully you can touch on both of those.
Oh boy, yeah. So, sorry, the first question
False
was
positives.
false positives. So, yeah, I mean, there is actually quite a dawning of awareness in the scientific community around this problem, and they're sort of working on it themselves. So there's a whole huge, there's workshops and week-long things about how to improve not just statistical design, but experimental design, because they realize that these are an issue. But unfortunately, in the pharmaceutical world, the bottom line drives everything, and so until it's a monetary problem, it's very difficult to figure out how to solve it. But yes, I agree that's an issue, but I think it's something that they're aware of and they're trying to solve. The second piece that you mentioned is interesting because, and I just want to share something with you, and that is the National Institutes of Mental Health actually are realizing that their traditional way of thinking about diagnosing people isn't working because it's not helping in terms of figuring out what to do with a patient. And so especially in the areas of autism, because these things are syndromes, but they're biologically based though. I mean, there's something biologically happening that's resulting in affecting behavior or affecting the response to a situation. And so they're starting now this program where they're trying to correlate behaviors, but with the underlying biological processes that are happening in the individual. So just like with cancer stuff, where they realize that tumors are actually, ovarian cancer is not ovarian cancer. It's a multitude of different types of cancer depending on the signature, the genetic signature of a particular tumor, which can vary within an individual even. So it's the same kind of approach. Can they better characterize at the molecular level what's happening physiologically in the individual and help use that information to help them understand how to treat that person? Because these things are so complicated, and it is, but how do you use the molecular information? How do you use your understanding of biology and apply that to individuals to help figure out what to do with that person?
I have nothing to add on the second piece. On the first piece, just a quick note that I do think that there's something that we can do around the issue of false positives, and I do think a lot of it is really related to just poor research design. Either at a regulatory or a legislative level, the decisions that are made about how the funds at NIH, for example, are allocated to specific research is being made by a small group of people who are part of that community. And those scientific review groups, which is what they're called, are groups of, 10, 12 people, basically, who've been steeped in this world for years and years, and the criteria by which they make those decisions is rather arbitrary and allows for a lot of flexibility. So I have a hypothesis, and I don't know if we could ever do anything with this, or actually whether it would help the number of animals, because it could. The problem with poor research design is that the way to make it better is often to use more animals from a statistical design perspective. But if we can sort of look at that and show that it would result in a lower number of animals, we could either do through legislation or regulatory reform try to require those scientific review groups to take into account the risk of poor research design in some meaningful way.
Yeah, and you can do sort of an analysis to see the minimum animal numbers that you would have to get a statistically significant difference. And so I work at a place called the OECD, which is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. They create test guidelines for everything that's traded in the world, including chemicals. And so if you affect the test guideline design there, you affect the test guideline that are used in all 36 member countries, which is most of the industrialized world. So at any rate, so we've been going through all of the test guidelines at the OECD and doing that kind of calculation to see what the minimum numbers would be in order for you to get a statistically significant, and it depends on the endpoint, it depends on what you're measuring too. But that's just something that should be done always, but it rarely is, especially in the research community. They don't think about it that way.
On the note of affecting pharmaceuticals' bottom line, maybe the trick is to just find novel ways to make it affect their bottom line. And I can see that being the case with testing animals in a statistical framework as well, which is you can often just crank up the number of animals you're using because there's no actual cost of using that animals, whether it's an administrative cost or a financial cost. So in both cases, I think probably has something to do with making the cost of doing that testing higher, either from a purely financial perspective or from a public perception perspective.
Yes, and this is how the Neves and this new institute sort of work in tandem to create an economic situation where the balance shifts.
Another question back here.
Kate, you mentioned the cruelty-free campaign for HSUS, and I know that both HSUS and Neves and MSPCA are all supportive of 2 state-level bills on animal research issues. So just since we've got a lot of Massachusetts residents in the room, I thought maybe you might want to take the opportunity to mention those briefly.
I think you should mention them.
Yeah, I think you should mention Steph, state director for HSUS.
Sure. Well, there's 2 pieces of state legislation that are pending this session that are refiles from last session that would protect animals used in research. So there's one that would promote the use of alternatives for animals used in cosmetic or product testing. When there are effective alternatives that are available, it would require the use of those alternatives. And then the other bill would promote the adoption of animals, dogs and cats specifically, at the end of their term in research if adoption is a viable option for them. And so we could use the help of Massachusetts residents in supporting those bills. So if you're up for contacting your legislators and encouraging them to support them as they move through this legislative process, that would be really helpful.
Yeah.
And there are similar bills in other states if you all happen to be residents of other states.
Yeah. Yeah, and just to add on to that, I mean, this is a great opportunity. The bill as it's currently structured it would not be the most advanced in the country, but we're really hopeful that we can build off of the success in California that just occurred in the last session to really create something that's super progressive and actually would result in probably the end of these types of products that are sold in Massachusetts from being sold in the future. So there's really strong potential here for something really good for animals.
And it just struck me too that one thing this organization could maybe do is to be that it says if alternatives are available, you could be a sort of a clearinghouse for listing all the alternatives that have been shown to work that then people can refer back to.
Hi, really enjoyed your discussion. I've got a question more about the sort of strategy and positioning of this new society. So it's something I've been interested in lately is the development of this One Health movement, and I'm wondering if you've thought about that. So that's promoting the idea that sort of animal health and human health are related. And it seems to me, on the one hand, that sounds great, but on the other hand, the way I've seen it actually deployed in practice seems to be a way for veterinary medical professionals to sort of increase their own professional status and hence the use of animals potentially in research. So I was sort of interested in how you're positioning yourself and this idea that you really need to get at students and academics who are seeing training on animals as central to the whole process. So it seems to me there may be both an opportunity but also a threat there in the sense that there is a counter movement to try and argue, well, we're doing this research on animals and that's going to help the animals as well as the humans, so let's not get rid of it. So curious about that.
You want to touch on that one at all?
I could say something, but I'm sure you have something to say.
No, go ahead.
Well, I've been noticing the sort of, I consider them quite cynical ads that say, if you love animals, you'll love animal research. You know, they have these ads around, and it's interesting to have that perspective. But my whole, what I devote my life to at the moment is trying to get people to realize that even that animal experimentation that we're doing, we do blindly because we're not using the information we already have. We don't think that much about what we do before we do it because a lot of it is sort of rote, and you do the same thing that you've always done with the same approach you've always had. So you're wasting a lot, even if you believe that animal experimentation is critical to what you're doing. So what I think is that if we use the information that we already have and we thought about things a lot better, there are technologies that we can use to understand animal diseases better than you can do in an experiment, better than you can do in an experiment in a living being, and no matter what species we're talking about. But you have to. One of the things that has so much has so much potential. This project is to. There's a limited number of resources. There's a limited number of hours in a day per researcher. There's a limited number of dollars in the research budget globally. And how do we make the shift from the way we've been doing everything, the way we always done everything, to the potential of this new future? Because they do, if you put all your money here, it takes away from what you're devoting here. So how do we shift some of this to this future that has so much potential and doesn't involve experimenting on living beings, whatever species. And I think this institute is really positioned to help accelerate that. I think it's happening because people are already seeing the shortcomings of these things, and they are shifting, but it's very slow. I mean, you've got this huge ship. You have the multi-billion-dollar animal research complex, industrial complex, whatever. I mean, people... And they're just steeped in it, and they don't think about it from another perspective. So this is a perfect accelerator for shifting this viewpoint.
Thank you. I hope so too. The other thing, just to add to that, is the numbers that we were quoting up here before does not include sort of the research that's being done for veterinary medicine development, which is specifically targeted to help animals, right? And sort of like the Purina example, where one of the things that we're getting back from Neves when we sort of do this, like what kind of pet industry type of thing are we supporting that's actually hurting animals in a meaningful way as part of their process of getting new products on the market? The sort of irony of that is something that seems to resonate really well with the sort of general public. I think there's a gap actually here. I think that it's been thought of. I think a lot of work is being done by a lot of organizations around regulatory toxicology and pharmaceuticals and all that kind of stuff. But there hasn't been a lot of focus on veterinary medicine development. And I do think because it is a multi-billion-dollar industry in its own right, that there probably is opportunity in the same vein. To try to adopt either this model or sort of more of a traditional nonprofit model where we could actually start to advocate in a meaningful way to make better the regulations and laws as they relate to doing animal testing. There's been a few things like pound seizure type of laws at the state level that prohibit these types of research facilities from going into local shelters and pulling animals out for research. But it hasn't really been a focus as far as I'm aware.
Not too much, just around the edges, as you say, when something comes up. I mean, there are certain instances where groups find a problem like this and then they advocate for a different way. Like, I mean, if you have a problem that somebody's researching somewhere and it could be taken care of in a clinical setting, for example. So try to shift it to a clinical setting where you have a already sick or already injured animal and you do your kind of training that way.
There has been a big growth in sort of volunteer trials where people, you rather than having to induce all of these conditions, Americans make 200 million visits to the veterinarian every year with animals that are already having problems. So you've seen a lot of growth in that as well. We have a question back here.
Yeah.
Hi. I read a lot about tissue engineering for human use and read about 3D printed kidneys and whatnot for human use. And I don't have a biology background, so I don't really quite understand it. But I'm wondering, is that going to be a game changer in terms of moving away? Or is it going to be something, just because it's a new technology, is it all of a sudden going to require a whole ton of new research that are going to bring in animals in order for it to be proven for humans?
That's another one for you, I think.
Yeah. Well, I mean, interestingly, I think both of those things are true. So because of the way the preclinical stuff is structured right now, that these new tissues and stuff will all be tested on animals before they go into humans. But these tissues are already proving to be game-changing in terms of our ability to test chemicals and do research on tissues that very well mimic the in vivo situations. So, and the other really interesting thing is these 3D printers and the different culturing techniques. You can now begin to create in the lab. You can create tissues from patients themselves, from people with specific genetic. And you can also make models that are very similar to, say, cystic fibrosis. I mean, the Harvard Beast Institute has cystic fibrotic lung on a chip. And so you can start to really study these diseases, complicated diseases in vitro. And that's very exciting and is already becoming a game changer.
Yeah, and then just my only addition to that one is, and you already said this, but I just want to reiterate it, is one of the challenges that we do experience here is that even when we're developing these new technologies, right now the process of validating them and sort of testing them actually is using animals again to make sure that they're as good or better than the animal models that already exist. And that's really messed up, and I'm hopeful that some of the data that already exists from these decades of, at this point we have 100 years worth of animal research data that's sort of just sitting out there. Hopefully some of these computer models.
Well, and we do have some progressive people in the government. There is at least a handful. And there's the National Institutes of Environmental Health. There's a group there, and they are doing some of this stuff, and it's really good that they are doing it because people believe them. So they're going back and looking at a lot of this animal data and looking at the variability of the animal data, and then just debunking this idea that these new methods need to be held up to the same standard as the animal data, because the animal data is it's all over the place, and it's far from being true, and especially for humans, it's not true. But then you have the question, well, what do you hold it up to? And that's where, again, this understanding of biology comes into play, because at a certain point, what you want to do is you want your research and your testing to actually be hypothesis-driven, which we used to do as scientists a long time ago, but we've gotten away from that in recent years. So go back, and when you're testing or thinking about something, you're basing it on a hypothesis based on your understanding of biology. And so the new methods, with the results you get, you feed back into what you already know about biology, and does it make sense? Are the results you're getting making sense? So instead of comparing them to what happens in an animal when you empirically do the experiment, you're basing it on the context of what you know about biology, and you're ground truthing it that way. So it's actually quite a different way of thinking about validation, or than people are used to. But there's a lot of people that it's dawning on them, and they're trying to figure out now how we do this.
One last question right here.
A related question, and I guess I'm thinking about the big picture. There's a very plausible argument, very persuasive argument, if we can find ways of not using other species. There's a pathway in terms of technology and practice and so forth to get to that point. Where are we at in terms of just the technology, the techniques, the sort of alternatives that would be functional, plausible? What's the sort of timeline that you can see from that? Putting aside the cultural change and the investment, all that sort of stuff.
I see the technology is quite far ahead of, well, obviously it's far ahead of the implementation. So there are organ systems that have been developed. There's computer systems that are capable of making sense out of many, bazillion different types of data. But our ability as humans to interpret and implement the results of those things is lagging behind. In terms of a timeline, boy, man, 30 years. 30 years to complete replacement.
Yeah, I mean,
it may not be out of the question, and it also depends on the will.
That's right.
Because if we decided that was the goal as the United States, as a culture, like getting to the moon, yeah, absolutely could we do it? Absolutely. I mean, the technology fairly exists. It's the implementation and working out the rough edges.
It's not unlike we were saying with the cell-based agriculture. You know, to go from the very first proof of concept hamburger in 2013 to now 30 plus companies working on it in just in a few years. So
yeah, and the cost reducing from somewhere like $30,000 per patty down to a couple hundred at this point.
It was $330,000.
$330,000.
Yeah.
Right,
so price
right.
per pound was about $1 million per pound.
Yeah.
Then you went from the $330,000 hamburger to then you had, I think you had a $50,000 meatball to a $6,000 chicken strip, which still sounds crazy, but on a per pound basis, to go from $1 million a pound down to around a few $1,000s a pound just in a couple of years. I mean, on a graph that looks really good.
Yeah, it looked really great. Yeah, I'll take that.
And this brings up another area. I mean, we aren't just talking about biomedical research and sort of testing of pharmaceuticals of Impossible Foods. With their hamburger, they had a novel ingredient, heme, and because it was new, they felt that they were obligated to do some animal testing to prove that it was safe. So I think there was 188 rats that they had to, or mice or rats that they had to use, and they were killed, and it caused a lot of consternation. And so. To create a plant-based product, you had to kill animals. So there's a lot of room for alternatives here.
Yeah, and policy change, because that's ridiculous.
Yeah,
that is ridiculous. And the thing is, good markets like that, big markets like that, companies in that position can have an effect on the regulatory process.
Absolutely.
Food also.
Well, great. Well, thank you all for participating in our 5th annual Animal Law Week here, and I'd like to thank both the speakers, Nathan and Kate. So please join me in thanking them one last time.